The streets of Rome were never quiet. Horses clattered down cobbled roads. Merchants bellowed the price of figs and wine. Children chased each other around ancient columns while soldiers patrolled in armor that glinted like gold in the midday sun. But on that day, that rare Roman afternoon when the sun seemed too gentle and the wind too soft, something shifted in the air, as if history itself was holding its breath, because he had returned, Gaius Julius Caesar, not as a humble general returning from Gaul, not as a decorated commander, but as something more. As a man who had defied death, bent nations to his will, and stood at the gates of Rome like a god returning to Olympus. And Rome, in all her splendor and suspicion, trembled. For here was a man who had crossed the Rubicon not just with soldiers, but with destiny itself. And among those who watched from the marble steps of the Curia, there was one pair of eyes that saw more than the grandeur. Eyes that had once looked at Caesar with nothing but admiration. Marcus Junius Brutus. He was not just a senator. He was not merely a man of high name and noble blood. He was something far more dangerous. A man torn between love and loyalty, between what he felt and what he feared. And years before that fateful March day, Brutus had loved Caesar like a father. They had met in the golden years of Caesar's ascent, long before titles like dictator or tyrant stained the Senate's whispers. Caesar had seen something in the young Brutus, not just promise but conviction. A fire. The same fire Caesar had once carried in his own youth when the world was still a mountain to be climbed, not ruled. Rome will need men like you, Caesar had once said, clapping Brutus on the shoulder after a long evening of debate. Men who speak with their hearts before their mouths, who dream not for themselves but for the Republic. Brutus had smiled then, a genuine smile, not knowing how cruel time would be, how destiny could twist praise into prophecy, a friendship written in blood. There are few friendships in history written so deeply into the bones of empire. Brutus and Caesar shared more than politics. They shared evenings of wine and war stories, quiet conversations about philosophy and governance, and walks beneath Rome's moonlight where they dreamed out loud, not of power, but of peace. To Brutus, Caesar was more than a leader. He was a mentor, a man of unmatched intellect and spirit, someone who stood taller than the monuments they both passed by. But as Caesar grew in stature, as Gaul fell to his armies and the people chanted his name like a prayer, the Senate grew colder. Rome had always been a fragile dance of balance, and between Senate and people, between ambition and order. And Caesar? He had broken that balance. Whether by force or brilliance, he had become Rome's heartbeat. And the powerful, the old blood, of the Senate, men who clutched to their traditions like rusted shields, began to fear what would happen if he never stopped. They began to whisper. Not openly, not yet. But Brutus heard them. And at first he defended Caesar. He argued his greatness in the marble halls, refused to believe that power had changed the man he once called friend. But fear has a way of spreading like ink through water. And slowly the questions began to slip into Brutus's thoughts. What if Caesar never gives up power? What if he names himself king? What happens to the Republic then? He tried to push them away, tried to silence them. But truth has claws, and once it digs into your heart, it never lets go. The dagger in the shadows. The plan was never announced. It was whispered, passed in quiet corners, behind draped curtains, through trembling fingers holding wine cups. More than 60 senators, 60 men who once stood for Rome, now trembling in the shadow of one man's greatness. They called it libertas, freedom. They called it preservation, but in the end it was fear. And in the center of this storm, they needed Brutus. Not just for strategy, not just for numbers, but for legitimacy. Brutus wasn't just any senator. He was noble, revered, respected even by the people who worshipped Caesar. If Brutus, Caesar's own friend, stood with them, then perhaps it wouldn't be called murder. Perhaps they could call it salvation. And Brutus, torn by 1,000 sleepless nights, said yes. No man ever knows the exact moment his soul breaks. Perhaps it was the night Brutus stared at the stars and whispered an apology to the sky. Perhaps it was when he avoided Caesar's eyes in the Forum for the first time in years. Perhaps it was the morning of March 15th, 44 BC. The Ides of March. The fall of a god. The morning was warm. Too warm for spring. Caesar, draped in his white toga with the purple hem, ignored the warnings. His wife, Calpurnia, had begged him not to go to the Senate. She had dreamt of blood, of ruins, of a broken statue that bore his face. But Caesar, ever proud, ever defiant, laughed. "Shall I now fear shadows, my love?" he said, kissing her cheek. "Let cowards be ruled by omens. I am Caesar." He stepped out into the streets, where people still bowed, where children still called his name, where Rome still smiled. He did not see the swords. He did not see the eyes that once looked upon him with love, now looking through him. He walked into the Senate as he had done 1,000 times before. And then, the first blade struck. It was not Brutus, not yet. It was Casca, fumbling, frantic, shouting for the others, and suddenly, chaos, a flurry of movement, dozens of blades drawn like lightning. The white of Caesar's toga turned red within seconds. The air was filled with shouts and steel, betrayal and blood. Caesar tried to fight. Even as blade after blade struck his body, he stood until he turned and saw Brutus, his friend, his student, his son in all but name. Their eyes met, just for a breath, just long enough for the world to shatter. Caesar's hand trembled, his lips parted. The words came not in anger, but in heartbreak. "Et tu, Brute? You too, Brutus?" And in that moment, Caesar stopped resisting. He didn't cry, he didn't curse, he just fell. And the silence that followed wasn't just the quiet of death. It was the silence of something sacred being destroyed. After the storm, Rome did not celebrate. The streets were quiet that night. Even the wind felt unsure. The people who had once cheered Caesar's name stood in doorways, watching the shadows stretch longer than they should. And Brutus? He sat alone, the dagger still stained, his hands still trembling, his soul torn open. He had done what he thought was right, what he thought Rome needed, but it didn't feel like salvation. It felt like murder. And as the days passed, the world didn't cheer him. The Senate, once united, fractured. Antony, Caesar's loyal friend, rose like fire, vowing revenge. The Republic Brutus had tried to save. It collapsed anyway. The question lingered in the air, like smoke that never cleared. Did he kill a tyrant or a father? And every night that Brutus lay awake, staring into the blackness, he heard the same words echo over and over in his soul. "Et tu, Brute?"